This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards you see in this video by using my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa, and today I'm continuing with my March of the Machine limited set review. So far I've looked at every single card in the main set, but we still have to look at the cards from the Multiverse Legends bonus sheet. If you don't know what that is, it's a subset of 65 cards that are reprints of legendary creatures from throughout Magic's history, and every single pack will have one of them. It's a lot like Strixhaven's Mystical Archive or the Brothers Wars Retro Frame Artifacts. As in those formats, these cards will end up playing a significant role in the format, especially the uncommon ones, so it makes sense to review them too. Like with the rest of the set review, for each card I'll discuss how good I think it will be in this limited format, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. I'm evaluating these for play in limited and not in any other formats. One difference here is that I have played with like 90% of these in limited before, but I do have to evaluate them within this new, very different limited format, so I'm of course not going to be 100% correct about how good these cards will be in the format, but I will be updating you on how good these cards are, where I was wrong, and things like that as I learn more about the format. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and at the end of the set review, which is today, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, let's take a look at the cards from Multiverse Legends. First, there's Anafenza, Kin Tree Spirit. She costs 2 white mana for a 2/2 legendary spirit soldier at rare. And whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, bolster 1. This means you choose a creature with the least toughness among creatures you control and put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a powerful 2-drop. You don't have complete control over where the counter goes. You really only get to make a choice if you have 2 creatures with the same toughness, and those are your creatures with the least toughness, but that doesn't really matter. You're basically adding, put a +1/+1 counter somewhere on every single creature you have enter the battlefield that's not a token, and that is a huge upgrade. That makes us a 2-drop that can make things quickly get out of hand. This format also has a pretty strong +1/+1 counter theme. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's Daxos, Blessed by the Sun, which for 2 white is a 2-star legendary enchantment creature demigod at uncommon. Its toughness is equal to your devotion, 2 white. And whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, you gain 1 life. On its own, Daxos is a 2/2, and it will often have higher toughness than that, and it gives you a whole bunch of incidental life gain. That said, this format doesn't have a life gain deck in it exactly, nor does it really have an enchantment deck, and it also doesn't have that many cards that care about devotion, so it doesn't do much in terms of synergy. Still, the base card is impactful enough to be a C+. Next up, it's Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite, which for 5 generic and 2 white is a 4/7 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. She's got Vigilance. Other creatures you control get +2/+2. Creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. 7 mana might be a lot, but Elesh Norn delivers in a big way. She has a massive impact immediately. The combined impact of buffing all of your creatures and weakening all of your opponents creates a massive gap between the quality of your board and the quality of your opponents. She just completely sweeps away small creatures. If you have any board state at all when you play her, you're going to be able to attack your opponent really hard, and the game might just be over before they ever get to untap. I'm giving her an A+. Next, it's Kenrith the Returned King, who for 4 generic and a white is a 5/5 legendary human noble at Mythic Rare, and he's got 5 abilities, 1 for each color of mana. For 1 red, all creatures gain trample and haste until end of turn. For 1 generic and a green, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. For 2 generic and a white, target player gains 5 life. For 3 generic and a blue, target player draws a card. And for 4 generic and a black, you can put target creature cards from a graveyard onto the battlefield under its owner's control. This is one of these cards that wasn't actually part of a limited format because it was the buy-a-box promo, I guess, for Throne of Eldraine, but obviously it's really powerful. He's a 5 mana 5/5 with access to a bunch of different abilities. Even if you're only able to use 1 or 2 of these abilities, like, if you could just use the white one, he's still a really good card because that activated ability can create a big difference in the game, and you have a very efficient creature. But if you can access the other abilities, he gets way better. They're all pretty good in certain situations. The ability to reanimate stuff is maybe the most powerful, but they all give you a pretty good return for your investment in terms of mana. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Quende, Pride of Femeref, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/2 legendary human knight at uncommon. It's got double strike, and creatures you control with first strike have double strike. A 4-mana 2/2 with double strike isn't a complete disaster, and this does upgrade a few other cards. Unfortunately, there aren't actually very many first strikers in this set. It does go well with a common one that is going to be a key card, especially for blue-white decks. Sword, Sorn, Cavalier, 2-mana 2/2 that gets first strike when you play a knight. Quende happens to be a knight, so when it comes into play, it actually gains double strike, and that's going to line up pretty nicely sometimes, but that's the only white common with first strike, and there are only 2 other non-rare or mythic first strikers, so it's probably just a C. Next up, we've got Sram, Senior Edificer. For 1 generic and a white, it's a 2/2 legendary Dwarf Advisor at rare, and whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, you draw a card. This set doesn't have an overwhelming number of cards with these types. There are 7 auras, 3 vehicles, and 8 equipment, and a lot less of those if we only talk about commons and uncommons. That said, there's definitely enough of them around for Sram to draw you a card every now and then, and he has a fine baseline, giving him a C+. Next up, it's Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. For 1 generic and a white, she's a 2/1 legendary human soldier at rare with first strike, and non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Thalia is always a nice card because she has good base stats. A 2/1 with first strike is relevant pretty much all game long. Her tax effect is, of course, symmetrical, but because you're the one playing her, you can figure out the right time to play her when she hurts you the least. And you can also just end up with a deck that doesn't have that many non-creature spells in it, although this format does have a bunch of battles, and everyone's going to be playing them, so that's going to be a little harder maybe, but still, she's a B-. Next up, it's Baral, Chief of Compliance. For 1 generic and a blue, he's a 1/3 legendary human wizard at rare. Your instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, so whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So decreasing the cost of your spells is nice, and there are a couple of playable counter spells in the set, so you might loot sometimes, and it has an okay stat line. The whole package is probably a C+. Next up, it's Emry, Lurker of the Lock, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/2 legendary merfolk wizard at rare. It costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you mill 4 cards, and you can tap it and choose an artifact card in your graveyard, and you can cast that card this turn. This set really isn't artifact heavy enough for Emry to be awesome. She does mill you, which blue-black can get some value out of, and if you have a few good artifacts that you can keep recurring, she does get a little better, but she's probably just a D. Next up, it's Inga Rune Eyes. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a 3/3 legendary human wizard at uncommon. When she enters the battlefield, you scry 3, and when Inga Rune Eyes dies, draw 3 cards if 3 or more creatures died this turn. This wasn't amazing in Kaldheim, and I don't think it will be here either. You're mostly just paying for a 4-mana 3/3 with scry 3. Luckily, that's a decent rate. Triggering her other ability is harder than you might think. Obviously, if you can trigger that ability, she's absurd, but actually making it happen really doesn't come up that often, giving her a C. Next up, it's Jin Gataxius, Core Augur. For 8 generic and 2 blue, he's a 5/4 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It's got Flash, and at the beginning of your instep, you draw 7 cards. Each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7, so 10 mana just isn't accessible enough and limited for Jin Gataxius to ever come down. There is a bit of reanimation and some other ways to cheat things into play here and there, and if you can make that happen, he gets kind of silly, but it isn't a big enough feature in the format for him to be anything more than an F. Next up, it's Tetsuko Umezawa, Fugitive. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/3 legendary human rogue at uncommon, and creatures you control with power or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. So at worst, Tetsuko is an unblockable 1/3, and most blue decks will have a few other creatures who can become unblockable. This is a C. Next up, it's Ayara, First of Lochthwain, which costs 3 black mana for a 2/3 legendary elf noble at rare. When it enters the battlefield or another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and you can tap and sacrifice another black creature to draw a card. Triple black is a challenge in limited, but Ayara does a good job of paying you off if you do go mono or mostly black, as making most of your creatures drain 1 life on ETB is great, as is cashing them in for cards. She will be pretty nice even if you can't play her until later, but I think she's probably a B-, and she's probably a B+ if you can really end up in a deck that's close to mono black. Next up, it's Hirobi, Death's Wail. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 4/4 legendary spirit. At rare, it's got flying. And whenever a creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, destroy that creature. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer is a nice rate, but the rest of this card's text has a lot of pros and cons. It turns basically everything that targets anything into a removal spell, and that may benefit your opponent more than it benefits you. It's just hard to control how things will go there. Obviously, you can build around it to some extent, but you still can't count on your opponent not being capable of targeting anything on their own. They don't really have to build around it to just like point a combat trick at your best creature and kill it because Hirobi's in play. It's just a really weird card, and it was back in Kamigawa when this was originally printed. I think it's just to see, it can, on an empty board, you and your opponent are in top deck mode, it can end the game quickly. It can also allow you to remove a bunch of creatures, but the flip side is, well, maybe your opponent can also just destroy your whole board. Next up, it's Saizan, Perverter of Truth, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 6/5 legendary demon spirit at rare. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. This effect is symmetrical, and your opponent gets to take advantage of those new cards first. They do also lose life first, but that doesn't really make up for things here. I don't like giving my opponent the cards right away. There's a decent chance that they'll just draw removal and kill Saizan and enjoy the cards that you gave them before you can ever draw any cards. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Sheoldred, Whispering One. For 5 generic and 2 black, it's a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It's got Swamp Walk. At the beginning of your upkeep, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature. She's great. You play her and pass the turn, and your opponent immediately loses something, and then if you get to your upkeep, you reanimate something. If you get to take advantage of that turn cycle even once, it's going to be hard for you to lose, and most of the time your opponent won't be able to deal with it before they at least lose a creature. That makes her a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next, it's Skithiryx, the Blight Dragon, which costs 3 generic and 2 black for a 4/4 Phyrexian Dragon Skeleton at Mythic Rare. It's got Flying and Infect. You can pay 1 black mana and it gains haste until end of turn. You can also pay 2 black mana to regenerate it. A 5-mana 4/4 flyer is a fine baseline, and this throws in a whole lot of extra value, including the ability to end the game with poison. Do remember this is Infect and not Toxic, so it does mean Skithiryx doesn't do damage to your opponent. Skithiryx can only give your opponent poison counters, and that can be something of a downside, especially because the rest of your deck isn't going to be that good at poisoning your opponent, because I think poison really only shows up on one other card in this bonus sheet, and then it shows up on like a mythic rare dinosaur that you also have to transform to get to the poison in the first place. So it is kind of a downside, Infect is, to some extent. At the same time, you can also say it's an upside because Skithiryx can end the game in 3 swings instead of 5, which is what it would take if it was doing all the damage on its own. But do keep that in mind. It can gain haste and it can regenerate too, so even if you aren't able to attack with Skithiryx for whatever reason, it is a real problem as a blocker. Your opponent just can't attack through it effectively, and regeneration means it's very hard to kill. I'm giving Skithiryx a B+. Another thing to keep in mind with Infect, by the way, that I should have mentioned, is there is upside when it comes to doing combat damage because it does the damage in the form of -1/-1 counters, so it can block something even bigger than it and regenerate and put a bunch of -1/-1 counters on it. So Infect isn't all downside, but it is enough of one that I just want to give him a B+. Next up, it is Timoret, Chosen from Death. For 2 black mana, this is a 2-star legendary enchantment creature demigod at uncommon. Its toughness is equal to your devotion to black, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and exile up to 2 cards from graveyards. You gain 1 life for each creature card exiled this way. Hating on graveyards has some real value in this format, especially against blue-black, and this is almost always going to have a pretty nice stat line and bring some incidental life gain along. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Yargle, Glutton of Urborg. For 4 generic and a black, it is a legendary frog spirit at uncommon, and it's vanilla. It's just a 9/3. I guess if you want a big vanilla creature, this does the job, but you really shouldn't want that. The low toughness makes him a real liability. Back in Dominaria, he was kind of almost acceptable because there was more legendary stuff going on, but there's not much of that here, so you're only playing this if you're desperate. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Captain Lannery Storm. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 2/2 legendary human pirate at rare with haste, and when it attacks, you create a treasure token. Whenever you sack a treasure, Lannery Storm gets +1/+0 until end of turn. The turn this comes down, it's a 3-mana 2/2 with haste that makes a treasure when it attacks, and that means it can threaten to be a 3/2. If she's allowed to attack more than once, the value she brings in terms of treasure can be really nice. She does have diminishing returns the longer the game goes on though, especially in a set that isn't exactly treasure heavy. There are some cards that make treasure, but I wouldn't say it's a big theme in the set either, giving her a C+. Next up, it's Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. For 1 red mana, it's a 2/1 legendary creature monkey pirate at Mythic Rare. When it deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, you may cast that card, and it has dash for 1 generic and a red. And that means you can cast it for this dash cost. If you do, it gains haste, and it's returned from the battlefield to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next instep. Ragavan is obviously insane in basically every constructed format he's legal in, and he's banned in some too, but in a non-cube limited format like this one, he's merely really good. If you play him early, he will be giving you a whole bunch of value since you're going to effectively draw cards and ramp and fix your mana. If your opponent can't kill or block Ragavan, he will just win you the game from turn 1, and that's nuts. And dash means you can sneak it in sometimes for that powerful trigger, but the board does quickly become populated enough that Ragavan just ends up being a 1-mana 2/1 in the mid to late game, and sometimes even earlier. So amazing on turn 1, and each turn after that gets progressively less impressive. Still presents a problem. Your opponent does have to block it. If you have tricks and stuff to back him up, he can be a real pest, but I think it's just a B in limited. Next up, it's Squee the Immortal. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/1 legendary goblin at rare, and you can cast it from the graveyard or exile. A 3-mana 2/1 isn't efficient, but Squee just does not stay dead. The ability to continually return from the graveyard or exile means you can just keep trading this off if you're on defense, or just keep sending it in if you're on offense. It also works well with sacrifice stuff, and there is a fair bit of it in the set in black-red. It is still just a 2/1, but that recursion, pretty nice. I'm giving him a B-. Next, it's Urabrask the Hidden, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. Creatures you control have haste. Creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So on its own, this is a 5-mana 4/4 with haste, which is fine, and the upside of haste to all your other stuff is pretty real. And if your opponent has to have their things enter tapped, and they do, your chances of hitting your opponent with your creatures is a lot higher, especially because, hey, they also have haste. This makes life very difficult on your opponent, giving it a B+. Next, it's Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 legendary human shaman at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to Valduk, create a 3/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste. Exile those tokens at the beginning of the next instep. As I noted when talking about SRAM, auras and equipment are around, but they aren't a massive theme in the set either. This is probably a build around as a result because I don't think every red deck will automatically have things it needs for this to spit out a spark elemental every turn. It's probably a D+ in most red decks and a C+ in a deck that has enough auras and equipment to support this, which probably means like 4. Next up, it's Zada Hedron Grinder, which costs 3 generic and a red for a 3/3 legendary goblin ally at uncommon. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Zada can be really sweet if you're a deck that uses combat tricks and goes wide, because using a combat trick on one creature means it gets cast on every single one of your other creatures, which can be absolutely insane. And going wide and playing tricks are things that red decks often do. That said, the base level you get here is a hill giant, so I think this does still need a build around grade. If your deck has like 1 trick in it, it's just not going to be enough for her. You probably need at least 3, and then she starts to be pretty insane. It's probably a D+ in your typical deck and a C+ in a red deck with enough tricks in it. Next up, it's Finn the Fangbearer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 legendary human warrior at uncommon. It's got Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. So even if you have 0 other Death Touch creatures in your deck, Finn being a 1-mana 1/3 with Death Touch is already a solid card, and there are a few other Death Touchers at lower rarities, including 2 commons. That said, you probably shouldn't really count on poisoning someone out with this, especially because the larger set, as I said earlier, just doesn't have much in the way of poison, giving him a C. Next up, it's Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma. This 3 generic and a green 4/3 legendary bear is rare, and it makes your creature spells with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and when it attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 against trample until end of turn. On its own, Goreclaw attacks as a 5/4 trampler, and if you have some other beefy creatures in your hand or in play, it gets even better. You'll often have those big creatures in green too, giving this a B. Next up, it's Renata, Called to the Hunt, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a star 3 legendary enchantment creature demigod at uncommon. Its power is equal to your devotion to green, and each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Giving your creatures a +1/+1 counter when they enter is great, especially because this set has a +1/+1 counter theme, and sometimes Renata will even have pretty high power, giving her a B. Next up, it's Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger. For 6 generic and 2 green, this is a 7/6 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It has Trample. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This doesn't cost quite as much as Jin-Gitaxias, but it has a similar problem. 8 mana is a lot, and that is all magnified by the fact that Vorinclex's abilities honestly aren't even that great by the late game and limited most of the time. By the time you can cast this, you're not really going to have anything to do with all the multiplied mana that you have, and your opponent probably also isn't that badly affected by having their lands not untap. It is a big trampler with upside, but the mana cost plus the underwhelming nature of the 2 abilities makes me think it's just an F. Next up, it's Eudora, Grave Gardener. For 4 generic and a green, it's a 5/5 legendary Treefolk Druid at rare. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. She's got decent stats, and turning your dead creatures into a bit of mana isn't too bad. Kind of like we saw with Vorinclex, the downside here is how often do you really need a bunch more mana when you're at this stage of the game? But if a creature going to your graveyard isn't going to give you any value, you might as well have it come back as a land. It is nice it's a May ability, so if you do have things you want to go to your graveyard, you can still have them go there. I think she's a C+. Next up, it's Agar, the Freezing Flame. For 1 generic, a blue and a red, it's a 3/3 legendary giant wizard at uncommon. Whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess damage, if a giant wizard or spell you control dealt damage to it this turn, draw a card. This was a powerhouse in Kaldheim Limited. Pretty much an uncommon bomb, because that deck had so many giants and wizards in it. That's what blue-red was about. It also had a spell deck in blue-red. Like, all of it was exactly what Agar wanted you to do. So playing it and then setting up a situation where you drew that first card right away was very easy, and things could really snowball from there. It's not going to be nearly as good here. This set has 2 giants. One of them is common. The set does have wizards, but most of them aren't large enough that they're going to be doing much in the way of excess damage. Agar does count itself, so you do have situations where you can just attack with Agar, and if your opponent's best option is like chump blocking, it's going to feel pretty bad, but there's still going to be a lot of situations where you just can't do excess damage. It is worth noting you can put damage on creatures in such a way, even if Agar is double blocked and going to die, you can find a way to do all the damage to one of their creatures and do the excess damage and at least get the 2-for-1. So that does come up, but Agar on its own isn't really going to do it. The good news is, that's all bad news really about how much worse Agar is in this format than it was last time. The good news is there are several common and uncommon removal spells that do damage, of course, and adding a cantrip effect to those is pretty insane. All in all, I think he's a C+. It's just too hard to actually trigger this in this format for him to be amazing. Next up, we have Erixmithy's Slumbering Isle, which for 2 generic, a green, and a blue is a 12/12 legendary Kraken at rare. It enters the battlefield tapped with 5 slumber counters on it. As long as it has a slumber counter on it, it's a land. Reminder text says it's not a creature. And whenever you cast a spell, you can remove a slumber counter from Erixmithy's, and you can tap it for a green and a blue. This is pretty bad and limited. When you first play it, it's basically a 4-mana rock that can tap for 2 mana, but that enters tapped. That's, I guess, not a complete disaster, but it's certainly not what you want to be doing. Doesn't add to the board in any way, and it's going to be quite some time before you do. You have to cast 5 spells before this ever becomes a 12/12, and then even after you do all of that work to turn this into a 12/12, it doesn't have evasion or anything like that. It just seems like this is going to be too slow, not impact the board enough for several turns. It's just an F. Next up, it's Atraxa, Praetor's Voice. For a green, white, blue, and black mana, it's a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian Angel Horror at Mythic Rare. It has Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, Proliferate. Mana isn't amazing in this format, but if you're playing green, and you will be if you're playing Atraxa, you have access to some fixing. There are also common dual lands, and Skittering Surveyor is an artifact at common that's good at fixing. My point here is that casting this is possible, but not guaranteed. If you can cast her, she's insane. Proliferate does serious work in this format. With all the +1/+1 counters around and battles, you can make battles you are defending even harder for your opponent to defeat, which is hilarious. And obviously, you also just have a creature with a bunch of amazing keywords that can simply win the game by attacking. Mana is difficult enough in this format that I can't really give her a straight up bomb grade, but I am going to give her a B+. Next up, it's Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths. We're 2 generic, a blue and a black. It's a 3/2 legendary human advisor at rare. It has menace. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent looks at the top 3 cards of your library and separates them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile. Put one pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So this is always going to give you at least a 2-for-1, and the stuff you put in your graveyard might actually also help you in the blue-black deck. And a 4-mana 3/2 with menace isn't that bad either. Overall, this is a nice value card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Aurelia, the War Leader. For 2 generic, 2 red, and 2 white, it's a 3/4 legendary angel at Mythic rare. It has flying, vigilance, and haste, and when it attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Thanks to having both flying and haste, this is likely to be able to come down and attack successfully the turn it comes down, then give you another extra combat phase on that same turn, and even if that just means you can only attack with her again, you're going to feel pretty good about the investment. The times where you have a developed board that can also attack again, it's going to feel absolutely insane. There will be times where she can't attack effectively. It's not like she's unblockable or something, but haste and flying do a pretty good job of allowing her to sneak in on that first hit, even if there is something around big enough to effectively block her. I think she does enough to be a bomb. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Brutaclad Telcore Engineer. For 4 generic, a blue, and a red, it's a 4/4 legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Artificer. At rare, creature tokens you control have haste. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 2/1 blue Phyrexian Myrrh artifact creature token. Then you may choose a token you control. If you do, each other token you control becomes a copy of that token. A 6-mana 4/4 that spits out a 2/1 with haste every turn is a strong card, and this offers some additional upside. If you play it in your first main phase, you're going to get that 2/1 the turn you play it, so even if Brutaclad does go down, you have some value left over, and if it's left in play, it becomes a huge problem for your opponent. This works well with the incubators in the format because they all have base power 0/0 and then have +1/+1 counters on them, so if you all have them become 2/1s, they will become significantly larger. Even without the incubator upside here, I think this is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Dina Soul Steeper. For a black and a green, it's a 1/3 legendary Dryad Druid at uncommon. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life, and you can pay 1 generic and sack another creature. And Dina Soul Steeper gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Life gain, not a big theme in the format. It's around, but there's not really any other payoffs for it. She will make your life gain cards a little bit better, and then she has an okay activated ability that can threaten to make her power really high in some situations, giving her a C. Next up, it's Uzuri, Claw of Progress. For 2 generic, a green and a blue, it's a 3/3 Phyrexian Elf Warrior at Mythic rare. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you get an experience counter. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is the number of experience counters you have. If you have enough small creatures, Uzuri is going to do some pretty sweet stuff, as even just getting 1 +1/+1 counter a turn out of it is pretty awesome, and you can end up with far more. It does take some work to really get it going, since it's just a hill giant at first, but I think most decks will be able to get at least 1 experience counter relatively easy, and at that point you're talking about a really good card, giving it a B. Next up, it's Firesong and Sunspeaker. For 4 generic, a red, and a white, it is a 4/6 legendary Minotaur Cleric at rare. Red instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink. Whenever a white instant or sorcery spell causes you to gain life, Firesong and Sunspeaker deals 3 damage to target creature or player. This gets pretty nuts with damaging spells, and there are of course many of those in red, and there's even one in white. Gaining life off of all of those is pretty powerful. This gets really nuts with the 1 white spell in the format that does damage, Elspeth Smite. If you have this in play when you cast that, the Smite will kill something, gain you 3 life, and then also let you lightning bolt something else. That's not going to come up a ton because this is a rare from the bonus sheet, and Elspeth's Smite is an uncommon, but it is kind of a cool combo you can pull off. Mostly, this gives you some nice additional life when you're casting your red removal spells. It's probably good enough for a C+. Next up, it's Furia, Judge of Valor, which for 2 generic, a white and 2 black is a 2/4 legendary angel cleric at uncommon. It's got flying and lifelink, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So last time we saw her, she was a signpost uncommon in a black-white deck that was all about casting second spells, so the format was really well set up for you to trigger this ability. While that isn't true here, I still think she's going to be pretty good. She has decent stats, a 5 mana 2/4 flying and lifelink is passable, and she's going to draw you a card a decent chunk of the time. You're not always able to double spell, but doing it once while she's in play isn't exactly insane. She even loads your graveyard if you're interested in that, giving her a B. Next up, it's Grimgrin, Corpseborn. For 3 generic, a blue and a black, it's a 5/5 legendary zombie warrior at Mythic Rare. It enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step. You can sack another creature to untap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it attacks, destroy target creature defending player controls, then put a +1/+1 counter on Grimgrin. Entering tapped is obviously a problem, but there is plenty of sacrifice fodder in this format that lets this untap, and it's a free sacrifice effect, which can always be a real threat. And the fact it destroys something when it does attack is really nice. This can really go wild if the board is set up correctly for it, but it does take some serious work. I think that keeps it from being a bomb, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Gyruda, Doom of Depths, which costs 4 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana. It's a 6/6 legendary demon kraken at rare, and it's a companion. All 10 companions are in this set, which is pretty cool. If you don't know what a companion is, you can just play a card that has Companion as a regular card in your deck, but if you meet a certain deck building requirement, you get to start with that card in your sideboard, and you can pay 3 generic mana to put that card from your sideboard into your hand. In other words, you always have access to this card. Originally, this mechanic just let you play them from your sideboard, so it was like starting every game with an 8-card hand, which was completely insane, but even since they've been nerfed, they're quite strong. Gyruda's requirement is that you can only have a deck with even mana values, and when it enters the battlefield, each player mills 4 cards. Put a creature card with an even mana value from among the milled cards onto the battlefield under your control. If you didn't play with these last time, you might have the same initial reaction that basically all of us did. We said, there's no way that making my deck worse in some way by having to make my deck, in this case, only have cards with an even mana value, that can't be worth it, right? But keep in mind, this is something we were all thinking when it was free to just cast them from your sideboard, but it was hard to imagine that these would be worth using, most of them anyway, just because it is such a big requirement. But it turns out, for some of them, including Gyruda, I think, trying to play it as a companion is a good idea. Basically, how that works out is you have access to one of the best cards in your entire deck every single game if you meet the requirement, and because this also synergizes with its requirement, you are very likely to succeed when you mill 4 cards. You're probably going to be able to reanimate something. Now, I don't think Gyruda is a companion where you should be playing it as your companion 100% of the time, especially if you pick it up late. But the great thing about Gyruda is it's pretty much a bomb anyway. It's a 6 mana 6/6 that is very likely to reanimate something when it enters the battlefield. It doesn't always, but it does mill 4 of your cards, 4 of your opponent's cards, and that is reasonably likely to hit something. It also synergizes well with what blue-black has going on. It wants your opponent to get 8 cards in their graveyard so you can get some extra value. This will help you do that. So it's a great card, it's a bomb, it's an A. If you can play it as a companion, it is even better. So if you take it early, it's worth kind of seeing if you can meet the companion requirement. You do need to make sure you have a lot of 2-drops to compensate for the fact that you're not going to have any 3-drops, but it is doable, and Gyruda is quite strong. Next up, it's Emoti, Celebrant of Bounty, which costs 3 generic, a green, and a blue for a 3/1 uncommon legendary Naga Druid with Cascade. When you cast this, that means you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order, and spells you cast with mana value 6 or greater have Cascade. A 5 mana 3/1 is abysmal on the vanilla test, but this has Cascade, so you're going to get something else. Even if you just hit a 1 mana thing, you're going to feel okay about your investment, and if you hit something that costs 3 or 4, it's going to feel absolutely insane. then granting Cascade to your expensive stuff is a nice thing to have around too, and if you can follow this by casting a 6-drop on that next turn, you're basically going to win. That's not all going to line up perfectly, but you're basically always getting a 2-for-1 with this card, and then it has some really big upside, giving it a B+. Next up, it is Gigantha the Wellspring, which costs 4 generic and a red-green hybrid mana for a 5/5 elemental elk at rare. It's another companion. This one says the requirement is no card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its cost, and you can pay 1 and tap it to add Wooburg to the mana pool, but that mana can't be spent to cast generic mana costs. This companion isn't quite as powerful as Karuga is, but it's also way easier to meet its requirement. Sometimes in Limited, you just end up in a deck that meets this requirement anyway without even trying. Typically, you end up making maybe 2 or 3 different picks in order to play Gigantha as your companion, and the cost is definitely worth effectively having this available to you in your opening hand every single game, even with the 3-mana tax. The card itself has a nice body and can even help you with mana a little bit. In the olden days of companions just being castable from your sideboard, Gigantha was a bomb because it started out, again, as like an 8th card in your opening hand. I think with the tax, it's more like a B+, and if you end up playing it just in your main deck, it's probably closer to a B-. Next up, it's Judith the Scourge Diva, which for 1 generic, a black, and a red is a 2/2 legendary human shaman at rare. Your other creatures get +1/+0, and whenever another non-token creature you control dies, Judith does 1 damage to any target. This is going to be great in this format. Black-red looks like a strong sacrifice deck, so adding a ping every time one of your things dies is great. She does say non-token, so she doesn't let you go crazy with incubators, but she still has a massive amount of upside. Even just buffing all of your stuff right away would be a pretty good card. Going to combat with Judith in play is an absolute nightmare for your opponent, and she even counts herself, so it's hard for your opponent to ever escape Judith without something getting pinged. I think she's a bomb, giving her an A-. Next up, it's Jury, Master of the Review, which for a black and a red is a 1/1 legendary human shaman at uncommon. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Jury, and when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So again, sacrifice decks are a thing in black-red, and this is a great payoff for the deck. Even if it never grows, the fail case is a 2-mana 1/1 that pings something when it dies. This isn't great, if that's all it ever is, but that's the fail case, and this becomes more and more of a problem as the game goes on. Basically, this gives black-red decks an additional signpost uncommon, which is pretty sweet, giving it a B. Next up, it's Kahira the Orphan Guard, which costs 1 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana for a 3/2 legendary cat beast at rare. It has Companion. In this case, to meet the requirement, every creature in your deck has to be a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast. It has Vigilance, and it's also a Lord for all those creature types, giving them +1/+1 and Vigilance. This might be the companion that got the biggest downgrade from Ikoria Limited. That format had tons of creatures with these types, so it was actually doable to have Kahira as a companion. It wasn't easy, but it did happen. In this format, it's pretty much impossible. There just aren't enough cats, elementals, nightmares, dinosaurs, and beasts in green-white in this set for that to work out. Or in any color, really, for it to work out. But it is a solid card for your main deck. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance that will probably buff a handful of creatures in your deck, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Karuga the Macro Sage, which costs 3 generic and 2 blue-green mana for a 5/4 legendary dinosaur hippo at rare. Its companion requirement is that your starting deck contains only cards with mana value 3 or greater and land cards, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with mana value 3 or greater. Not playing anything on your first 2 turns can be very sketchy, and it was more doable in Ikoria because you had cards with cycling that you could at least cycle away on turn 1 and 2 so that you were doing something. That's not true in this format. There's a tiny bit of cycling, but not enough. So making this your companion is going to be challenging, especially if the format is one where you need to be adding to the board by turn 2. And it probably is. Most formats are these days. The good news is Karuga is great in your main deck. Even if it just draws you 1 card when it enters the battlefield, it's going to be good, and sometimes it draws you multiple cards. This is one that I mostly don't recommend as playing as a companion. If the format ends up being really slow, it could work out, but for now, mostly a main deck card, but it's great as a main deck card, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Croxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. For a black and a red, it's a 6/6 legendary Elder Giant at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And when it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. And it has escape for 2 black and 2 red. And that means you can cast it from your graveyard for that cost, plus exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard. Playing this on 2 is decent. If it was just a sorcery that did that, it would probably be a C-. But if it ever escapes from the graveyard, it's a complete and utter beating for your opponent. When this effect triggers multiple times, it just keeps getting better and better. It's more likely to start damaging your opponent. And oh, by the way, they're also getting attacked by a 6/6. Black does have ways to mill itself in the format too, so bringing Croxa back from the graveyard isn't crazy. It still takes some pretty real work though, so I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn. For 2 generic, a green, and a white, it's a 2/1 legendary unicorn. At rare, it's got lifelink. At the beginning of each end step, if you gain life this turn, distribute up to that many +1/+1 counters among any number of other target creatures. This has lifelink, so it can gain life all on its own, but it's also small and inefficient enough that it isn't really going to survive gaining you that life, and it needs to. You need some other incidental life gain around to really take advantage, and while life gain isn't a huge thing in the set, there are enough cards in green-white that gain you life that this looks like it'll be reasonable. It does have pretty bad base stats and dies to many cheap removal spells, so it's ideal to wait to play her until you know you can get the counters that turn, giving her a B-. Next up, it's Luris of the Dream Den, which for 1 generic and 2 white-black hybrid mana is a 3/2 Cat Nightmare at uncommon. It's another companion. This one says each permanent card in your starting deck has mana value 2 or less. It's got lifelink, and once during each of your turns, you may cast a permanent spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. Arguably the most powerful of all the companions in constructed formats, Luris is kind of tough to make as your companion, though maybe not as hard as it looks at first. Note that it says permanent card, so that just means, well, all your permanents have to cost 1 or 2 or 0 mana. You can still run more expensive removal spells and all sorts of stuff like that. And if you do manage to meet the companion requirement, it means Luris will be able to get basically all non-land permanents out of your graveyard. You can cast 1 from your graveyard every turn, and that's just absurd, especially because you get a 3 mana 3/2 with lifelink. The best thing to do with Luris is to play it and then play something out of your graveyard, and if you do that, you're already way ahead. I mostly don't recommend forcing this as a companion. I think it is challenging enough. This does give you a significant disadvantage. It was actually worth playing as a companion in original Ikoria with the original companion rules, but this format looks less well suited to allowing you to play a bunch of 1 mana and 2 mana things, and the companion rule has weakened the card as well. These days, I think it's probably a B+. If you can play it and get a thing back from your graveyard, and you're going to be able to do that most of the time, it's going to feel great. And if it's allowed to stay in play, it can become an insane value engine. Next up, we've got Lutri, the Spell Chaser, which for 1 generic and 2 blue-red hybrid mana is a 3/2 legendary elemental otter at rare. It's another companion. This one says each non-land card in your starting deck has to have a different name. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is easiest to make as your companion. Lutri and Gigantha are both pretty easy. I think Lutri is a little bit easier. A lot of your limited decks just end up being singleton decks anyway, so you don't have to try that hard. It can be a little bit of a bummer if there's like a premium removal spell that you could have a second copy of, but you've got Lutri, so maybe you shouldn't take it. But most of the time, you're not going to pay much of a cost to make Lutri your companion. And it is, in most ways, less powerful than the other really exciting ones we've seen. It's not insanely powerful like some of them are, but the fact that it's easiest to make your companion, it is still a powerful card too. I mean, a 3 mana 3/2 with flash that copies an instant or sorcery you control is great. You can cast some cheap removal spell, cast Lutri, copy it, kill something else, and you get a nice 2-for-1 and a decent body. Giving Lutri a B+. That is the grade when it's your companion. It probably drops more to a B if you're not playing it as your companion. Next up, it's Niv-Mizzet Reborn, which costs 1 of each color of mana. It's a 6/6 legendary dragon avatar at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each color pair, choose a card that's exactly those colors from among them. Put the chosen cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The mana here is rough, and there aren't really enough cards in this set that Niv-Mizzet can hit with that effect that it's great. Your typical deck will have like 2 cards that he can draw for you, so he isn't even always going to be able to draw you 1 card, and he kind of needs to be if you're jumping through this many hoops to cast this. I think he's just a D. Next up, it's Obosh the Prey Piercer, which for 3 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana is a 3/5 legendary Hellion Horror at rare. It's another companion. This one wants your starting deck to contain only cards with odd mana values and land cards. If a source you control with an odd mana value would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. So on its own, Obosh is effectively a 5 mana 6/5, and obviously it basically buffs the power and amplifies the damage of all of your things that are odd numbered. That is a hard requirement to meet. This format does have 1-drops, and you're going to need them if you really want to play Obosh. But I do think it's actually a little harder to do than playing the even mana, because 2-drops are usually easier to come by than 1-drops are. So this isn't one where I'd say you should always be trying to play this as a companion. You definitely should if you can, but the good news is, like the rest, he's really good even if he's just in your main deck. Again, the base is that it's a 5 mana 6/5, and you can still not quite meet the companion requirement, but still sort of keep an eye out for good, odd-costed cards that do damage, whether they're burn spells or creatures or whatever. So Obosh is still really good, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Radha Coalition Warlord, which costs 2 generic, a red and a green for a 3/3 legendary elf warrior at uncommon. It has domain, and when it becomes tapped, another target creature you control gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Radha isn't going to be nearly as good in this format as she was in Dominaria United. That format was really well set up to get multiple land types in play. It had a common cycle of dual lands that actually had dual land types. This one doesn't, and it's just not a format that pays you off that much for playing all these different lands. Radha alone isn't a good enough reason. So mostly, she's a hill giant that offers +2/+2 when she taps, which usually means she has to attack. That's okay, but it's not anything special, giving her a C. Next up, it's Wrath Weatherlight Stalwart. For a white and a blue, it's a 1/3 legendary human wizard at uncommon. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control. If you do, draw a card. You can pay 3 generic and 2 white to give your whole board +1/+1 in vigilance until end of turn. This was powerful the last time we saw it, and it will be here too. Blue-white isn't as into spells this time around as it was when Wrath was the signpost uncommon for a spell deck, but you will have spells, and this gives you the option to draw extra cards off of them. Even if you just draw 1, it's going to feel pretty good, and the mass pump effect here is really meaningful too, giving him a B. Next up, it's Rayav Master Smith. For a red and a white, it's a 2/2 legendary dwarf artificer at uncommon, and whenever a creature you control that's enchanted or equipped attacks, that creature gains double strike until end of turn. As I've said a few times, there are a decent number of auras and equipments in this set, but not so many that this is going to be super easy to trigger. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Rona Sheoldred's Faithful. For 1 generic, a blue, and 2 black, it's a 3/4 legendary human wizard at uncommon. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life. You may cast Rona Sheoldred's Faithful from your graveyard by discarding 2 cards in addition to paying its other costs. Adding some incidental life loss to your spells is nice, and blue-black in this format also mills itself enough that her recursive ability matters too, giving her a C+. Next up, it's Shanna Sisay's Legacy, which costs a green and a white for a 0/0 legendary human warrior at uncommon. It can't be the target of abilities your opponents control, and it gets +1/+1 for each creature you control. She tends to scale as the game goes on, and the fact she can't be targeted by abilities comes up sometimes too. Green-white looks like it's good enough at going wide in the format for her to be pretty nice, giving her a C+. Next up, it's Taigam Ojutai Master, which for 2 generic, a white and a blue, is a 3/4 legendary human monk at rare. Instant sorcery and dragon spells you control can't be countered. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, if Taigam Ojutai Master attack this turn, that spell gains rebound, and that means you exile it as it resolves, and at the beginning of your next upkeep, you get to cast it again without paying its mana cost. The uncounterable part here will only very rarely come up, but if you can make a single spell rebound with this, it's going to feel pretty great. It'll turn that spell into at least a 2-for-1. You won't always be able to attack with Taigam though, and have it survive, and it needs to for that ability to trigger. It is just a 3/4, and that means there's lots of board states where it can't attack, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Teysa Karlov, which costs 2 generic, a white, and a black. It's a 2/4 legendary human advisor at rare. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and creature tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. There are definitely enough creature tokens in this format, especially in black-white, which is the color pair that's the most interested in incubator tokens. There's enough of those that the creature token upside this has here definitely matters. The death trigger part of the card will probably come up a little bit less, but every format has a decent number of cards that do something when they die. She was especially gross the last time we saw her because the Orzhov mechanic was one where if your creature died, it made some number of spirit tokens. So you can see she amplified the number of spirits you got and gave them vigilance and lifelink, and that was pretty great. Incubators don't usually involve something dying, though there are a few cards that when they die make incubators, and I guess this will do pretty well with that effect too. But yeah, she looks pretty good is the point, giving her a B. Next up, it's Umori the Collector, which costs 2 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana. It's a 4/5 legendary ooze at rare. Its companion requirement, each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a card type, and spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. This is one that I don't really think is worth making into a companion. It was already borderline not worth it before they nerfed the rule for companion in original Ikoria, because you had to play a deck entirely of creatures, which could be a little bit tricky. And I think doing that here for a card that you also have to pay 3 mana to put into your hand probably isn't worth it. But the good news, you get a 4 mana, 4/5 that reduces the cost of one of your spell types. Usually you're going to name creature. That's a good card just in your main deck, giving it a B. Next up, it's Yerok the Desecrated, which for 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, is a 3/5 legendary elemental horror at Mythic Rare. It's got Death Touch and Lifelink. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Enter the battlefield abilities are plentiful enough in this set for Yerok to do the same kind of silly stuff he usually does, and a 5 mana 3/5 with Death Touch and Lifelink is pretty good to start with. The problem is the mana, and it does take a little bit of work to really get full value out of him, but I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Yorion Sky Nomad, which costs 3 generic and 2 blue-white hybrid mana. It's a 4/5 legendary bird spirit at rare. It's another companion. Your starting deck contains at least 20 cards more than the minimum deck size, which means 60 cards in limited. It has flying, and whenever it enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Yorion is actually pretty easy to make your companion, especially these days, because the average power level of cards is so much higher than it used to be. There really aren't that many cards that are straight up unplayable, so going up to a 60-card deck in limited to make Yorion your companion is often worth it. Sure, the average power level of the cards in your deck is going to be a little bit lower, but do keep in mind some of those 20 cards are going to be lands, so it's not like you're jamming in 20 extra cards you drafted into your deck or anything like that. And what you end up with is a big, efficient flyer that has some pretty serious into the battlefield power. If you don't feel like you can go the companion route, though, I do think I recommend it in this case. But if you do decide not to, it's still a really good card as a 5 mana 4/5 flyer with this ability, giving it an A. And our last card is also our last companion. It's Zerta the Dawnwaker. It costs 1 generic and 2 red-white mana for a 3/3 legendary elemental fox at rare. Its companion requirement is each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability. Abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana cost to less than 1 mana, and you can pay 1 and tap it to make a creature unable to block this turn. So it's pretty much impossible for Zerta to be your companion in this format, but like all of these, it's a nice card no matter what. It's a 3 mana 3/3. That's solid. You are going to have some activated abilities. Making them cheaper is nice. It helps you transform all of the creatures that transform with Phyrexian mana, for example. It makes the cost of transforming an incubator cheaper, like it does stuff. And it can make things unable to block, which sometimes matters. I think it's a B. So those are all the Multiverse Legends card, and now I've talked about every single card in the main set and all the Multiverse Legends cards, but March of the Machine content is going to keep marching on. There will be an archetype guide in the near future. There's going to be a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. I'm going to do a Nissa notes video on the best commons and uncommons in the set, and we'll even have draft videos in the very near future because it's almost time for the early access streamer event. So if all of that stuff interests you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, consider liking it and sharing it so that more people can like it and share it too. And if you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. You can also find it in the description. Thanks for watching.